Mr. Bozeman.
Mr. President.
Senator from Virginia.
Mr. President, I ask that the proceedings of the quorum be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Mr. President, as we get started again on this next Congress, and I'd like to congratulate the presiding officer for his joining this chamber, and as someone who spent during my first 2 years in the Senate a lot of time having the opportunity to preside, I commend him for those actions and look forward to working with him on a variety of projects. Mr. President, what I want to do today is continue a tradition that I actually inherited from one of our former colleagues, Senator Ted Kaufman of Delaware. Senator Kaufman, who had been a long-time employee of the Senate, came to this floor on a fairly regular basis during his time here to basically celebrate and acknowledge the, in most cases, tireless, unsung work of so many of our federal employees. As we debate budgets and debt and deficit and oftentimes recognize that we have to make extraordinarily difficult choices and cuts, behind all of those cuts in many instances are federal employees who do remarkable work in keeping us safe and providing services and helping our country grow. Ted Kaufman used to come down here and on a regular basis and celebrate some of those unsung heroes, and I was proud to continue this tradition last Congress and look forward to carrying it on through another session. I start this next Congress actually celebrating two great federal employees, both who happen to be Virginians, I might add, who serve as excellent role models. They represent the thousands of professionals who work quietly every day across our intelligence community to keep our nation safe. Very often these professionals work in anonymity, and many risk their lives in troubled spots far away from the limelight. And that is how it should be. But as we've seen with certain incidents abroad recently, sometimes they pay with the highest sign of sacrifice in terms of their lives. Mr. President, for their service, for the late nights and early mornings away from their families, for the risks they take and the sacrifices they make every day, and because they not hear this nearly enough, allow me to say thank you to those members of the intelligence community. Today, I would like to briefly tell the remarkable stories of two extraordinary women who built their careers at the Central Intelligence Agency. Jean Verifay Vertefeuille passed away, this is Jean right here, passed away on December 29th at the age of 80 after a brief illness. In announcing her death to the CIA family, Acting Director Michael Morrell appropriately described Ms. Vertefeuille as an icon within the agency. If her story were not true, it would read something like a spy novel. Jean joined the CIA when she graduated from college in 1954. 1954, that was the year I was born. That was the year Dick Durbin was 32. At a time when the American intelligence community was best described as an old boys club. She was hired at the CIA as a GS4 typist. Now, again, a woman coming out of college in 1954 hired as a typist. But over her career that stretched nearly a half-century, Jean Vertefeuille blazed a trail for women in the National Clandestine Service. She methodically worked her way up to leadership positions. There were overseas postings in Ethiopia, Finland, and at The Hague. She became an expert in Soviet intelligence and spycraft, and she retired as a member of the Senior Intelligence Service in 1992. But even after her retirement, she continued her work for the agency as a contractor, making still more valuable contributions and working without a day's break in service until she became ill just last summer. As her obituary reads, quote, "She remained a quiet agency soldier, purposely nondescript and selflessly dedicated. She lived alone and walked to work. But, quote, if she was a gray figure at the agency, Ms. Vertefeuille was also a tenacious and effective one. And in October 1986 was asked to lead a task force to investigate the disappearance of Russians whom the CIA had hired to spy against their own country. Together with her colleagues at the CIA, she invested years in the methodical and painstaking hunt for a mole. And it was through her efforts and the good work of many others that we ultimately unmasked the notorious traitor Aldrich Ames in 1994. And again, remember, this is a woman who joined the CIA in 1954 as a typist. Mr. Ames turned out to be one of the most dangerous traitors in the history of our nation. Thanks in large measure to Ms. Vertefeuille, he was convicted of espionage and is now serving a life prison term without parole. But Jean Vertefeuille's story does not end there. The Washington Post recently described how one of her colleagues, Sandy Grimes, another Virginian who worked with her on the Ames task force, stepped up over the past year to care for Jean as she was battling cancer. Sandy Grimes, a career CIA employee whose parents worked on the Manhattan Project, ultimately served as Jean's primary caregiver. She sat with her each day during the final 3 months of her remarkable life. She monitored Jean's care and tried to make sure that she remained comfortable. She often brought personal messages of support and appreciation from their former CIA colleagues. Quote from Ms. Grimes, "I felt an obligation to be there with her. I can't imagine not doing it. I was the one Jean would accept. I owed it to her as a friend." Now, by all accounts, Jean Vertefeuille was an intensely private woman, and she doubtless would recoil at the attention she's now receiving. But one cannot help but be inspired by this true life story of service and patriotism and friendship demonstrated by these two great employees, Sandy Grimes and the late Jean Vertefeuille. Their services reflect well on the work of thousands of other intelligence professionals whose names can never be revealed. Both of them deserve our recognition and thanks. Mr. President, during the last Congress, I joined 14 senators in a joint resolution to mark the U.S. Intelligence Professionals Day. My hope is that we can actually, at some point during this Congress, gather more supporters so that we could actually get a day designated to recognize the enormous contribution that intelligence professionals made on a more formalized basis. Again, this was an effort to bring respectful attention to these quiet professionals who literally, as a member now of the intelligence community, I can testify to, keep our nation safe every day without any thought of recognition. Again, I look forward to working with my colleagues to reintroduce this resolution in the next Congress. Again, Mr. President, as I conclude my remarks, and I see my friend, the senator from Illinois here, the distinguished minority leader, or Majority Whip. We've spent a lot of time over the last 2.5 years grappling with the challenges around debt and deficit and trying to make some of the very hard choices we're going to need to make as a nation. And while it appears that we may be avoiding some of this, the immediate consequences of the so-called debt ceiling debate, which I'm glad to see, never should the full faith and credit of the United States be used as a political hostage. But as we make some of the challenging choices, and I again want to compliment my friend, the senator from Illinois, who has been as stalwart as anyone in this chamber at stepping up and being willing to speak truth to even those who are the most supportive about some of the challenges and choices we have to make. We are going to have to proceed at a level of spending that is less than what we've had in the past. But as we think about cutting back budgets, I think it is important to remember that behind many of these budgets, they're not just numbers, but they're incredible professionals who give their life service to making a stronger nation. So with this tribute to Gene and Sandy, I commend these two great federal employees. I will, again, be down on a regular basis to celebrate federal employees throughout this Congress because too often many disparage government in today's day in life, sometimes disparage government service. Well, but for Gene Verteve, we might not have as safe a nation as we do today. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.
President.
Senator from Illinois.
Mr. President, let me say to my colleague from Virginia, I will accept his kind words as at least an indirect apology for the defamation which he included in his speech, suggesting that I was somehow an ancient mariner here in the Senate. I wear my trousers rolled, but not quite as rolled as you suggested. I thank you, too, for your leadership on this deficit and debt issue. It's not over. We still have a lot to do. And we have to do it thoughtfully. And I'm glad that you highlighted these two federal employees. I read recently the obituary of the one that you highlighted. It was an extraordinary story of a woman who persevered in an agency which didn't have much use for women beyond secretarial status and became a real asset of the United States and made us a safer nation. So I'm glad you did that. And I'm glad you're continuing this tradition of acknowledging these important federal employees. I thank my friend from Virginia. Mr. President, it's been said that in St. Louis, Missouri, baseball isn't a sport, it's a religion. And if that's true, Stan Musial was the St. Louis civic patron saint. Stan Musial was an icon in St. Louis. He was the best ball player ever to wear a Cardinals uniform, and he was one of the best to ever play that great game. Stan Musial was my childhood hero when I was a boy, and he remains a hero in my life to this day. You know, when you've reached my age and maybe my station in life, you're supposed to be beyond the stage of swooning adolescence. But when it comes to Stan Musial, I'm a 10-year-old kid all over again in East St. Louis, Illinois, buying more bubble gum than I can possibly afford in the hope that I would open up one of those packages and find covered with pink powder that card that had Stan Musial's picture on it. It was the treasure of my youth. And it would be so today if my mom hadn't thrown all those cards away. Well, Stan Musial's death Sunday at the age of 92 has hit the Cardinals nationwide like a death in the family. One Cardinals fan spoke for many of us when she told a St. Louis newspaper that losing Stan Musial is like losing a grandparent. It's hard not to tear up. I grew up in East St. Louis, right across the river. My most prized possession when I was a kid, my very first Stan Musial Rawlings baseball glove. As a kid, I rubbed that glove with something called Glovoleum until I was the only one who could still see Stan the Man Musial's name burned in the leather. One of the highlights of my life came just 2 years ago when I got to meet Stan Musial in person for the very first time in my life. It was at the White House, February 11th, 2011. Stan Musial was there to receive from President Obama the Presidential Medal of Freedom. He is one of only 8 other baseball players in the history of America to receive that prestigious honor. And listen to the company he joined: Joe DiMaggio, Jackie Robinson, Ted Williams, Roberto Clemente, Hank Aaron, Frank Robinson, and the famous Buck O'Neill. At the White House, I stood patiently waiting for the moment to ask Stan Musial to sign that old baseball glove, which I still have since I was a kid. He agreed to do so. What a thrill. I was 10 years old all over again. You know, outside Busch Stadium in St. Louis is a statue of Stan the Man in his playing prime. He's coiled up in a batting style that every coach said, don't bat like Stan the Man Musial, even though he has great numbers. If you do that, you'll never hit the ball. We all tried. The coaches were right. Etched into the base of that statue are words that Major League Baseball Commissioner Ford Frick said when Stan retired in 1963, and I quote, "Here stands baseball's perfect warrior. Here stands baseball's perfect knight." On the field and off, Stan Musial was always a gentleman, always a champion. He exemplified the values of sportsmanship, discipline, hard work, grace, consistency, and a love of family. Baseball broadcaster Vin Scully said, a Hall of Famer himself, said, "How good was Stan Musial? He was good enough to take your breath away." Stan Musial played his entire career, 22 years, for the St. Louis Cardinals. He did take off one season in 1945 to serve our country in the United States Navy during World War II. His 3,026 games with the same club are second only to 3,308 games over 23 years by Carl Yastrzemski with the Boston Red Sox. When Stan Musial retired from baseball after the 1963 season, he held 29 National League records and 17 Major League records. Here are just some of his career numbers. An batting average of 331, an on-base percentage of .417, 3,630 hits, 725 doubles, 177 triples, 475 homers, and the first homer I can ever remember seeing on television. It was the All-Star game in St. Louis, and darned if Stan Musial didn't get up in the 12th inning, parking a home run into the outfield stands, winning it for the National League. Couldn't have been more thrilled at my first exposure to baseball on television. He had 1,951 RBIs and 1,949 runs. He's the only baseball player to finish his career in the top 25 in all of these categories. Where did he get that nickname? It was coined not by a Cardinals fan, but by a Brooklyn Dodgers fan in May 1946, after Musial's 4 hits helped lead the Cardinals to a 13-4 drubbing of the Dodgers, the Brooklyn Dodgers. Every time Stan Musial came to the plate, the fans in Ebbets Field said, "Here comes the man," and the name stuck. The legendary baseball writer Red Barber once described the 1947 season as the year all hell broke loose in baseball. It was the year that Jackie Robinson integrated Major League Baseball. Jackie Robinson would later recall, when asked about his baseball career, that it was Stan Musial and Hank Greenberg, 2 players who went out of their way to be friendly and encouraging him in that historic and difficult year. Maybe Stan Musial's greatest baseball day came in May 2nd, 1954. It was a doubleheader in St. Louis against the New York Giants. He hit 3 homers in the first game and 2 in the second. In 1957, Stan Musial became the first Major League Baseball player to earn the amazing salary of $100,000 a year. 2 years later, when his batting average dipped to .255, it was Musial who went to the Cardinals owners and asked them to cut his salary back to $80,000. He wasn't playing up to what he thought he had the potential to play up to. Late in his final season, he stayed up all night waiting for the birth of his first grandchild, and the next day became the first grandfather to ever homer in the major leagues. Umpires, and this says something about what a gentleman he always was, umpires not once ever ejected Stan Musial from a baseball game in more than 3,000 games. On January the 21st, 1969, Stan Musial was elected to the Baseball Hall of Fame on the first ballot. He was named on 92% of the ballots, something to reflect on after what we just went through a few weeks ago when no one made the cut for the Baseball Hall of Fame. Stan Musial was the first player to receive 300 votes on the Hall of Fame ballot. When he retired, the St. Louis Cardinals retired his number 6. Cardinals manager Mike Matheny said that when the entire Cardinals team takes the field this year, they'll be wearing a number 6 patch in their uniforms. Matheny said it will be a call for us to do our very best to live up to that high standard of excellence. Matheny added, "You don't come across names like Warrior, Prince, and Knight by just having Hall of Fame statistics. It comes from making an impact on the lives of people. I was in that group, Ms. Matheny said. Mr. Musial, I say thank you. He's a perfect example of what it means to wear this jersey. I want to give credit to my colleague, Senator Claire McCaskill. She worked with me. In fact, she led the way in terms of the Presidential Medal of Freedom, along with Senator Bond for Stan Musial. And she came up with a great idea. I don't know if it's going to go anywhere, but I'm going to try to help her and make it a reality. She has suggested that we can honor this American hero, this regional hero, and the values that he stood for by naming the new bridge that's being built across the Mississippi River at St. Louis in the honor of Stan Musial. Now, I grew up on the Illinois side, and we kind of looked over at the Missouri side a little differently than most, and they looked at us a little differently, too. But if there's one thing that ever united us, it was baseball loyalty and Stan Musial. It's a perfect name for a bridge that spans between Illinois and Missouri in that region of the country. I am proud to join Senator Claire McCaskill, and we will be introducing a bill to name the bridge the Stan Musial Memorial Bridge. Other legislation is being considered in the Illinois and Missouri General Assemblies at this time. I wish them the best in honoring this great man. It was my great honor to join him on that historic day when he was given the Presidential Medal of Freedom, and he's always going to be my hero. Mr. President, I ask consent that my next statement be placed in several part in the record.
Without objection.
Mr. President, on a different topic, I rise today to reintroduce two pieces of legislation, the Know Before You Owe Act and the Fairness for Struggling Students Act. These bills will take critical steps toward addressing the student debt crisis facing America. Every week, my office is contacted by young people and their families who share with me their horror stories about student debt. Many of them are college students or graduates who are getting crushed by student loans the size of mortgages. All too often, these young people were lured into attending worthless for-profit colleges that left them with worthless diplomas and mountains of debt. It is disgraceful. But it's not only the young people facing this debt crisis. It's their parents, their siblings, even their grandparents who did them a favor by co-signing on these loans. They, too, are being held responsible when the loans go into default. Many of these people contact my office because they don't know where to turn. Their debt load leaves them feeling helpless. They are putting off major life decisions like buying a home or even starting a family because of crushing student debt. We can't stand idly by any longer and ignore this reality. We've got to step up and recognize that this student debt bomb is ticking away. Student loan debt among college students surpassed $1 trillion last year. The New York Fed reports that balances of student loans have now exceeded the balances on automobile loans and credit card debt in America. Student loans. That makes student loans the largest form of consumer debt outside of home mortgages. Last year, 37 million borrowers held student loan debt. That's more than 10% of the population of this country. The average balance, $24,300. But remember, that's an average. This is a massive amount of debt, and it's having a profound impact on the lives of the students and their families across America. The overall growth in student debt is troubling. The most pressing concern is what's known as private student loans. You know, if you go to a college, you could qualify for a government-guaranteed loan with dramatically lower interest rates, with accommodations based on your employment, and even some loan forgiveness. Not so when it comes to private student loans in most cases. Students who take out the federal loans receive affordable interest rates, a lot of protections and repayment options. Private student loans, totally different. Private student loans often have high variable interest rates, hefty origination fees, lack of repayment options, and unfortunately, crushing penalties. In 2012, the amount of outstanding private student loans exceeded $150 billion. Students are being steered into these private loans while they are still eligible for the better government loans. Why? Because somebody's making more money when they sign up for the private student loans. As a result, many students are being saddled with debt that they don't have to be saddled with, and sometimes debt they can never repay. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau last year reports that at least 850,000 individual private student loans were in default, amounting to more than $8 billion. Let me tell you about one of those students. I've opened up on my website, my official website, a place where those who have student loans and want to share their stories can come. Anna Wilcox, who's 31 years old, did. She attended the Brooks Institute of Photography, a for-profit college owned by the Career Education Corporation. Anna Wilcox saw a TV ad one day about this so-called Brooks Institute of Photography and decided she would call and inquire. Well, the school called her twice a day until she finally enrolled. The recruiter at the school, this Career Education Corporation school, told her that a Brooks degree would help her make $85,000 a year as a photographer. So Anna enrolled, and when she graduated in 2006, she had a debt of about $170,000, almost all of it in private student loans. Anna was 24 years old. $170,000 student debt from this for-profit school. With a variable interest rate that went as high as 18%, her balance just kept growing. Her monthly payments on her private student loan now exceed $1,000 a month. Her federal loans that she took out as well had low interest rates. She says those payments are reasonable and she can handle them. Her parents decided to help her out and co-signed on the loans. Now her parents in their 60s are on the hook as well. They have to change their life plans because they wanted to help their daughter, and now they're stuck with a debt of $170,000 for a worthless diploma from a for-profit school. Well, Anna did find a job, but the job doesn't pay anywhere near $85,000 a year. She just can't keep up with these staggering monthly loan payments. She said she'd like to file for bankruptcy, clean the slate, and start over. You see, she can't borrow money to go to a real school. She's wasted her borrowing power on these for-profit schools. Well, it doesn't do her any good to want to file for bankruptcy. Private student loans are not dischargeable in bankruptcy. If you sign up as a student, a college student, for one of these student loans, it is a debt that will follow you for a lifetime. There is no way to escape it. That's something to think about long and hard when students make that decision. Anna is very blunt and despondent. She said she made a big mistake going to the school. It was a waste. She thought she would get a better life by going to college. She didn't realize these for-profit schools, by and large, are a waste of money and debt that most students can never pay back. She has bad credit now and a mountain of debt to show for it. So what are we going to do about it? We're going to say, well, Anna, you should have been a little bit smarter when you were 19 years old and sat across the desk from somebody who said, we want you as a college student. You made your mistake, girl. That's the way it works in America. Now you've got to pay your price. Is that the answer? Is that the answer when these for-profit schools depend on the federal government and taxpayers for 85 to 95% of all the revenue they take in? If these for-profit schools, if you took the federal money we send their way, Mr. President, if these for-profit schools were a federal agency, it would be the 9th largest federal agency in America. That's how much money we're pouring into these for-profit schools. And let me just put 3 numbers out for people to reflect on. 12% of the students out of high school go to for-profit schools. You know their names. There are students who gather in Washington here and come to the galleries. They know what I'm talking about. Go on the internet and try to escape an ad for a for-profit school. University of Phoenix, DeVry, Kaplan, ring a bell? Well, I can tell you, these are the biggies, but there are hundreds of them. 12% of the students after high school go to for-profit schools. For-profit schools, though, account for 25% of all the federal aid to education. They just soak it up. Students borrow it, turn it over to the for-profit schools. The student's stuck with the debt. The for-profit school may never graduate you, but they got the money. Here's the third number to remember. 12, 25. The third number, 47. 47% of the student loan defaults in America are students from for-profit schools. Being dragged into these schools that charge way too much for tuition And then the student either can't finish the school or gets out of school and can't find a job. And they are stuck. I tell my students back home, if you're not sure, start at a community college. It's affordable, has a wide array of courses that can be offered to you. You'll learn a lot about yourself. You'll learn a lot about what you want to do in school, and you won't end up sunk in debt like these for-profit schools want to do to you. We've got to do something about Anna Wilcox's plight and many others just like her. I want to commend especially one community college in my state, the Elgin Community College. I've been visiting that school regularly and always come home thinking, this college gets it. They have implemented a financial counseling program that goes above and beyond anything that I would put into law. All of the students at Elgin Community College in Elgin, Illinois, must submit a monthly budget detailing all their costs when they're seeking financial aid. The student then has a mandatory one-on-one meeting with a counselor to review the loan balance, the repayment options, and what happens if you default. This community college has implemented a workshop for students who will be graduating during the upcoming semester to discuss repayment options and give them a complete summary of every loan they've taken out. These students are facing debt the likes of which they have never seen in their lives. They are motivated by all of the preaching they've heard from their parents, like me, saying, go to school, get a degree. They're ready to sign up because they want to do what they think is the right thing. They don't know the for-profit school is worthless. They don't know that thousands and thousands of dollars of debt will never be able to be repaid, and they don't know that debt will be with them for a lifetime. So here are some bills that I've introduced to address it. Students will benefit more, I believe, if they have the kind of loan counseling that we see at the Elgin Community College. I'm joining Senator Tom Harkin of Iowa, chairman of the HELP Committee, reintroducing the Know Before You Owe Private Student Loan Act of 2013. The legislation requires colleges to confirm a student's enrollment status, cost of attendance, and estimated federal financial aid assistance before any private student loan can be approved for that student. In other words, if you're eligible for the government loan, for goodness sakes, take that first. The private student loan is much more expensive, and it's tougher to pay it back. So we want to make sure that students who are eligible for government loans know that before they sign up for the private student loans. Often students have not even applied for federal aid before they are encouraged by some of these schools to apply for private student loans, or students haven't exhausted their eligibility under federal aid. Requiring school certification would give the school the opportunity to make students aware of their federal student aid options and the most affordable options. The bill would also require schools to counsel the students about their loan options. Schools would be required to inform students about the differences between federal loans and private student loans, and they are stark and dramatic. For students who decide to take out a private student loan, the bill would require lenders to provide them with quarterly up-to-date information about their balance and interest accrued. It isn't one of these deals where you just keep borrowing and borrowing and borrowing, and finally, when you're about to finish school or years later, they give you the total. You look at it and say, my goodness, I didn't realize I'd signed up for all of that debt. This legislation is supported by a large coalition of educational, student, and consumer organizations, and it's been recommended by the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. The other bill I'm reintroducing today is the Fairness for Struggling Students Act. This bill, co-sponsored by Senators Whitehouse, Franken, Harkin, and Jack Reed, would restore the Bankruptcy Code's pre-2005 treatment of private student loans. As I said earlier, since 2005, private student loans have enjoyed a privileged status under the Bankruptcy Code. They cannot be discharged in bankruptcy except under the most extreme circumstances. Only a few other types of debt can't be discharged in bankruptcy: criminal fines, child support, taxes, and alimony. In contrast, nearly all types of private unsecured debt, credit card debt, doctor bills, are dischargeable in bankruptcy, but not student loans. There was no good reason for Congress to give such preferred treatment to these financial institutions that are peddling these private student loans. It was a provision, a sweetheart provision, tucked into a massive bankruptcy reform bill with very little debate and even less justification. There's no evidence that private student loan borrowers were abusing the bankruptcy system before this law was changed. In fact, the private student loan market has been growing even before this measure was enacted into law. But the private student loan industry got a sweetheart deal out of Congress. And now we're in a situation where many students have overwhelming private student loan debt, and they can't repay and they cannot escape. This is devastating for those students and a drag on our overall economy. There was an article, Mr. President, a few months ago in the New York Times, and it talked about a grandmother who was having her Social Security check garnished because she had signed on as a co-signer of her granddaughter's student loan. Her granddaughter dropped out of college and couldn't pay back the loan, and now they were going after grandma's Social Security check. That's how serious this can be. A large coalition of student, educational, civil rights, and consumer organizations support this bill. I hope we can move forward with legislation this year. It's time to restore fairness to our bankruptcy code when it comes to student debt. Let me be clear. When used appropriately, student loans are valuable and important. I wouldn't be standing here today if I hadn't borrowed money from the federal government to go to college and law school. I never could have afforded it otherwise. It's called the National Defense Education Act, and if I told you the numbers that I borrowed, you'd realize how old I am. But at the time, it was scary to have that much debt coming fresh out of law school. I paid it back just like I was supposed to so the next generation could take over. But what I faced, the debt that I had incurred to go to school and law school, doesn't even come close to match what many students have to borrow in the first semester. And that, unfortunately, leads to a debt that some will be crushed with for a lifetime. In many instances, student loans help Americans get a quality higher education and the job skills they need to repay their loans and have a rewarding life and career. But unfortunately, there are far too many Americans who've been steered into high-cost private loans that will burden them for life and prevent them from fully contributing to our economy. It is about time that we woke up to the reality of what students, millions of students across America, are facing and their families. We have a responsibility to them over and above the profits that are being earned by for-profit schools and the financial institutions peddling these private student loans with these outrageous interest rates and terms. It is time for this Congress to listen to working families and their kids all across America to restore transparency, fairness, and common sense to private student loans. I urge my colleagues to support these bills, and I yield the floor.
Senator from Louisiana.
You know, Mr. President, more and more Americans from all walks of life, of both political parties, feel that there's not just a pond or a sea, but an ocean of difference between the real world where they live in Washington, D.C. They view, I think correctly, Washington, D.C. as a different planet where normal rules don't seem to apply. That's why on the first day I could introduce new legislation in this new Congress, I chose to introduce a package of reform measures, measures aimed at bridging that gap, bringing those two worlds together, returning Washington to the real world and reconnecting with the American people. Now, the American people are also concerned, rightly, of the bitter partisanship, the overly ideological tone of almost all of the debate we have here in Washington now, here in Congress. And I believe these sorts of reform measures, the 4 bills I've introduced in particular, can also help bridge that divide because they're not ideological, they're not partisan, they're good government reform, things that can and should and hopefully will bring us together and reconnect us with the American people. Again, it's another reason I chose to introduce this package of 4 reform measures, 4 good government bills on the first day I could introduce legislation this Congress. The first is a very simple and basic but fundamental idea, term limits for members of Congress. And I'm honored to be joined by 6 other senators right off the gate, right out of the box in terms of co-sponsoring this important legislation. Senators Paul and Ayotte, Coburn, Lee, Rubio, Cruz, and Johnson. I thank them for their co-sponsorship and their support. This measure would limit members of Congress in the House to 3 consecutive terms, total of 6 years, and the Senate to 2 consecutive terms, total of 12 years. It's the consensus measure supported by citizens groups very active and supportive of the concept of term limits. And the idea, again, is simple: to reconnect Congress with the American people, to do away with the notion of legislating as a career, and to get back to the founders' vision of citizen legislators. When I was in the state legislature, I authored and passed term limits for the state legislature. That required a state constitutional amendment, a big deal, a 2/3 vote in each body and then a vote of the people. But because of the people's voice rising up and being heard, we achieved that. And with that reform, which was voted overwhelmingly into the state constitution by the people of Louisiana, we have a regular influx now, a new, fresh blood, real experience from the real world that reconnects in a very healthy way the state legislature and all of us, the citizens who it's supposed to represent. That was needed for the state legislature. And if it was, and it was, it's needed 1,000 times more for Congress, because that divide, that sea, that ocean, that difference between different planets in the eyes of so many Americans is even greater between Congress and the real world, Congress and the American people. The second bill I've introduced is a bill to do away with automatic pay increases for members of Congress. That is present law, that we get regular increases of pay with no proposal, no bill put in the hopper, no debate, no need for an inconvenient vote. I think that's just outright wrong. I think it helps build that distrust on the part of the American people. And I'm joined by a bipartisan co-sponsor, Senator McCaskill of Missouri. I thank her for her leadership and her support of this measure. Again, the measure is very simple. Just repeal, do away with any automatic pay increases for members of Congress. If there's to be a pay increase, there should be a bill proposing it, an open debate, and a public vote. The third measure is also fully bipartisan. I'm introducing it with Senator Bill Nelson of Florida, and that's reform of the Corps of Engineers, something very important for our 2 states, but for indeed the whole country. In Louisiana, in Florida, and elsewhere, unfortunately, the Corps of Engineers has become a poster child for a dysfunctional federal government, a federal bureaucracy, a federal system that's just bogged down, doesn't work, takes 10 and 20 years to study something, never, ever getting to construction. We need to streamline and reform that process, and the Vitter-Nelson bill does just that by greatly streamlining the process by which Corps projects can come to fruition, putting state and local leaders more in charge of that effort, at first on a pilot basis. Hopefully we'll expand that in the future for important Corps of Engineers projects. Again, that's particularly important for our states of Louisiana and Florida, but it's important for so many states and for the country as a whole. And fourth and finally, I'm introducing a measure that I've had before to reform federal campaign finance law to prohibit PACs and campaign funds from employing members, spouses, or family members. That's just a way, quite frankly, in some circumstances, for members of Congress, politicians, to pad their family income. And I think that's wrong, and that leads directly to the real suspicion and low regard so many Americans hold this institution in. So again, this bill is simple, straightforward, but important. It would prohibit spouses and immediate family members of members of Congress from receiving payments from that member's campaign accounts or leadership PACs. That is a loophole, an area of abuse that we must close, that we must prohibit that abuse in the future. These 4 bills won't solve every problem out there. They won't be the be-all and end-all of important reform and good government efforts, but they would be an important start. They would help us truly reconnect with the American people, narrow this divide, which is so vast right now, between the real world, real Americans, and this institution. And they would be important nonpartisan, non-ideological reform efforts that we can gather around Republicans and Democrats alike to do something positive, to do something productive, and to reconnect with the American people. So I urge my colleagues of both parties to support these measures, to come on as co-sponsors. Many of you already have, and I thank you again for that. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor, and I suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
The Senate has spent much of the day on general speeches. Negotiations continue off the floor, changing Senate rules on the filibuster. The senators are also discussing whether to bring up a bill the House passed last week to provide $50 billion in aid for Hurricane Sandy relief. Meanwhile, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton continues her testimony on Capitol Hill right now before the House Foreign Affairs Committee. You can see that live on C-SPAN. And earlier today, she spoke before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. You can see all of her testimony tonight on C-SPAN starting at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. House Speaker John Boehner and other House Republicans spoke on Capitol Hill to reporters after voting for a bill known as the No Budget, No Pay Act that requires lawmakers to adopt a budget resolution by April 15th or have their pay withheld.
No budget, no pay. Listen, American families have to do a budget. They understand you can't continue to spend money that you don't have. We're committed to doing a budget on the House side, a budget that'll balance over the next 10 years. It's time for the Senate and the President to show the American people how they're willing to balance the budget over the next 10 years.
You know, today's vote was a first step towards trying to resolve the nation's fiscal crisis in a responsible manner. Look forward to working with the White House and the Senate to do so. It's interesting to note, with after almost 4 years having passed with an economy that's been struggling, the Senate never acted. It took 1 week in which their paychecks were on the line that now the Senate's going to step up and do the right thing. We welcome them to this debate around the budget of the nation and look forward to making sure we can begin to reduce the mountain of debt that is facing our children.
When you went across the country and you talked to individuals, they were always stunned to think it's been almost 4 years since the Senate even did a budget. When they'd sit back and they look, the last time they did a budget, the iPad wasn't introduced, the Chevy Volt was not introduced, there was no Instagram. It's shocking. Today you found a bipartisan vote that is asking for accountability and effectiveness in government. And that's exactly why we're moving it, and we welcome the opportunity that the Senate joins the debate and actually brings accountability back.
Today the House acted. The House acted to put Washington on a budget and to force a conversation about how we spend money. Everyone in America understands that budgets matter. And this budget matters to seniors that depend upon the benefits. It matters to middle-class, hardworking taxpayers that don't want to see more of their paycheck reduced. It matters to our children and the opportunities that they're going to have dependent upon Washington living within its means. We acted today. It's time for the Senate to act. It is time for the Senate to pass a budget. It has been nearly 4 years since the Senate has even passed a budget. People all across this country understand that you have to have a budget. You have to live within your means, and it's time for Washington to do likewise.
Today we did our job, and now it's up to Harry Reid and the Senate to do theirs. We've passed budgets for 3 years. They have yet to pass a budget. Now it's time for them to get to work and pass a budget.
Families' budget, local government's budget, businesses' budget. The federal government ought to have a budget. The Senate hasn't passed a budget in 4 years. That's wrong. We have a fiscal crisis in this country. It's hurting our economy. It's guaranteeing that our children and our grandchildren have a diminished future. We can't do that. We can't keep spending money we simply do not have. We know a debt crisis is coming, It's not a question of if, it's a question of when. And the way to fix that is to pass a budget to fix the problem. The House has acted. We need the Senate to join this debate so we can start debating the solutions about how to fix our fiscal crisis instead of debating whether there is a fiscal crisis in the first place.
I'll take a couple of questions.
Speaker Boehner, obviously now the next deadline is the sequester. What does the House plan to do on the sequester in the 113th Congress? Have you had any conversations with the President or Harry Reid about that so far?
I have not. The sequester is going to go into effect on March 1st unless there are cuts and reforms that get us on a plan to balance the budget over the next 10 years. It's as simple as that.
How do you feel that this strengthens your hand? I mean, Senator Reid was emphatic in his praise for you earlier in the day here. Do you think that, what do you make of them coming around here all of a sudden?
Listen, after 4 years, I'm glad the Senate has finally decided to act. Because there was no indication they were going to do a budget until we announced last week that we were going to move this bill that said pass a budget or no pay. And so I'm glad they're going to join the debate. But it's time for us to get serious about how, over the next 10 years, we balance this budget and put America on a sustainable fiscal path.
You have reached, under duress, various agreements over the last couple of years with Democrats over this stuff, budget agreements that have the force of law. How does non-binding budget resolution, getting the Senate to do that, increase the chances of a bipartisan, bicameral agreement on debt? How does it make that easier?
If both chambers have a budget, Democrat budget from the Senate, Republican budget from the House, now you've got competing visions for how we address this problem. Out of those competing visions, we're going to find some common ground. I'm hopeful that puts us on a path to balance the budget over the next 10 years.
Speaker, the President has brought forth his recommendations on gun legislation. You've said that you're going to focus on the debt ceiling, on the debt limit, and also on, the CR and everything like that. Do you intend to bring up any of those recommendations?
I expect that our committees will hold hearings and make decisions after they've had their hearings. Thank you all.
The House went on to pass that debt limit bill today with a vote of 285 to 144. The Hill writes that the Senate will immediately pass that bill that Speaker Boehner and the other House Republicans were talking about to extend the federal debt limit through mid-May, on condition that both chambers pass budget resolutions by April. And with outgoing Secretary of State Clinton on Capitol Hill today talking about the attack on the U.S. consulate in Benghazi, Libya, wanted to let you know that the Secretary of State nominee, Senator John Kerry, will go before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee tomorrow. That's the committee that Senator Kerry currently chairs. You can see that on C-SPAN and C-SPAN Radio live at 10 Eastern.
Thank you.